Today's guest is Mat Muntz, bass player, bagpipe player, and creator of the album Phantom Islands, released today. I will let Matt introduce himself.
I mean, I guess I'm, what am I? I'm like a composer and a bassist and a experimental bagpiper. I guess that's my byline. I don't know.
That's the line, yeah. Actually, I was going to ask you about that, what your main instrument was, because when I heard Fugue from the Vex collection, as well as your recent work on Phantom Island, something I was going to ask you is highly related to that, actually. I was wondering what your primary instrument was, because I was reading on the Vex collection album that you had, learned how to play the Croatian bagpipe for the album, and I was like, wait, I thought bagpipe was his main thing. So if you were talking about your history with the instrument and what led you to it and how you started on bass, I'm sure we'd all appreciate a good origin story.
Sure, yeah, happily. So first of all, most of the bagpipe that you hear on the Vex collection is actually being played by Matthew Welch, and he's a great, literally world-class, I think award-winning, Scottish bagpipe virtuoso, but also experimental opera composer, Balinese gamelan enthusiast. He kind of does everything. And so most of the Scottish bagpipe you hear is him. And I used to play Scottish bagpipe when I was a kid, but I quit because it was basically I really wanted to be a jazz boy, basically. And I mean, I guess, I don't know, I have to even go back further. Wow, because I was playing bass, was my main instrument. Before that, I was one of those kids that just played too many instruments, and eventually I kind of focused on bass, but bagpipes was something I had been interested in since I went on a family trip to Scotland when I was a little kid, and I saw it, and I was just kind of blown away by the sound. And there actually is a scene. I grew up in Seattle. There's a scene of Scottish bagpiping there, and I was taking lessons on it for a while and was in a pipe band. But to me, sort of the musical culture surrounding it is very kind of rigid, and it's based on military bands, and they kind of make you work through this rigid hierarchy before you can get to play the really beautiful, expressive music. And so I quit because I wasn't that into that culture of it, and I was kind of not into it as an instrument for a while, I think because of that. And then eventually I kind of worked my way back into being really into it through an interest in Korean music, which involves these really loud double reed instruments called taepyeongso. And the way the Vex collection came about was that I was hanging out with my friend Vicente Hansen, who's the other co-leader of it, and we were listening to this Korean stuff, and he was studying with Gamin, who's playing the Korean instruments on the record. And he was like, hey, you used to play bagpipes, right? Wouldn't it be cool to do some kind of Korean double reed bagpipe thing? And I was like, cool, let's do it. We'll write the grant. We won't get it. It's fine. And then we got it. And then we had to do it. And so luckily we found Matthew Welch to actually play the Scottish bagpipes. And in the middle of all of this, I got roped into playing Croatian bagpipe at an event that my wife is a singer from Croatia named Astrid Kuljanic. She's great, and she was doing a performance connected to the Croatian embassy at the Kennedy Center in Washington D.C. and we were playing kind of interpretations of some traditional repertoire from the specific region she's from, and there was a folklore ensemble, and they found out that I used to play the bagpipes. So I was like, well, you can just play this one. And I had to so basically for the Vex collection at the premiere, That was the third time I had ever played that instrument in public. The second time was a few months earlier at the Kennedy Center, and the time before that was like some random gig in a Croatian church somewhere. So I kind of got, I tried to get out, but they pulled me back in to the bagpipes. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I guess I would say my main instrument is bass, but now I don't even know. Like right now, I'm actually performing a lot more on bagpipes than bass, so it's a bit of an identity crisis, I guess. Yeah.
I guess since bagpipes are a more obscure instrument, you might get more opportunities for people asking you to do that. Maybe they're fewer and far between, stuff like that. Did you I see the term Croatian bagpipes here on the album description for the Vex collection, and I know you also mentioned Scottish bagpipes. Is there some kind of really important difference between those? Are there like different registers, different tunings? Like, what's the bagpipe terminology we need to know?
Yeah, so they're basically completely different instruments, I would say. The only thing is similar is that you squeeze the bag and you like wiggle your fingers, basically. But so the Scottish bagpipe that everyone is more familiar with, probably, it's basically there's a bag and there's 4 pipes. You have the one you play on, which is called the chanter, in which there's a double reed and it has a conical bore, so that's why it's so loud. And then you have these 3 pipes that are on your shoulder, which are drones, which are basically tuned to octaves of A, which is sort of the central modal note of the pipe. And because you have 3 of them, the overtones like kind of lock in this really resonant, beautiful way. And that basic model of like chanter plus drone is sort of like the default bagpipe thing. Like Bulgarian bagpipes are similar. There's only 1 drone. There's German bagpipes, whatever. The Croatian one is strange because rather than having like a chanter and drones, you have 1 chanter, but inside of it are 2 pipes with 2 reeds that are tuned to the same pitch. And from what research I've done, I believe this is descended basically from a type of bagpipe that we find in like the Middle East and North Africa, where it's basically just 2 pipes in unison that you play at the same time to make it louder and to make the timbre kind of warm and buzzy kind of. But then with the Croatian bagpipe, the interesting thing is that the holes are not symmetrical on it. So what happens is when you play it, actually you get these sort of parallel harmonies. And the way that those harmonies are tuned is related to this style of vocal and instrumental music from this specific region of Croatia. If you imagine like Italy, you imagine the very top of the boot, and if you like go around the top of the sea there, it's right there. It's this region called Istria, which is sort of, it's between the sort of Slavic world and the Italian world. And right there, they have this crazy vocal music. And I'll send you some recordings if you want to put them in. Yes. Really hilarious version of Ode to Joy tuned in this way, which I always show to people. But yeah, so it's these very, and it's a folk music, so it's not super codified, but basically it's these very narrow, what we could call minor thirds moving in parallel. And it has this very distinct kind of scary sound to it. And to me, as soon as I heard that music, it just really captured my imagination. So that's really so it is very different. And the tone is very different on the Croatian bagpipe. The reeds are much quieter. It's not like a military instrument like the Scottish bagpipes. So it has this whole other set of associations with it.
Have you always been interested in Croatian folk music? Is that how you got interested in the bagpipes in the first place?
I was always interested in Balkan music in general from when I was younger. But I didn't really find out about any of this music in this part of Croatia until I met my now wife, Astrid. and her cousin actually is the one who plays this bagpipe, and he kind of gave me my lessons in a sort of traditional pedagogical style where they'll give you the instrument, they'll teach you like one melody, and then they're like, okay, now go somewhere where we can't hear you until you sound good, and then come back. So I went through that process. I really just found it, and it came at a time when I was getting more and more interested in microtonal music and alternate tuning systems in different world music traditions, and this was sort of this thing that I had never heard anybody talk about, and it just sounded so distinctive, and it was just really it was hitting my neurons in the right places at the right time.
Yeah, no, all those traditions are so fascinating. They hit so many great buttons that people pretend aren't allowed, like in Western pop music.
Oh yeah,
but they're just so great. I wonder, you said Astrid performed at the National Kennedy Center, right? So how is there a way that performers deal with the microtonality of the folk music they're quoting? Like, did they tune it to 12-tone equal temperament? Did they perform it on authentic instruments? What's sort of the MO?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. And there's like a lot of answers to it. Actually, I wrote a paper that kind of deals with this, so I'll try not to be too long-winded about it. But
you can
basically, I can't. All right, maybe I will.
Yes.
So this system, what we call the Istrian scale, was basically codified in the 19th century when this region was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was because of composers from this part of Croatia would go to the conservatories in Vienna and Budapest, and then they would learn, Western theory, and then they would try to fit their folk music into it. So there were basically people. There's this guy named Ivan Matić Ronjgov, who's like kind of the most famous theorist of it, who he would write about how like he could recognize that it was a microtonal music. He specifically was like, yeah, I want to play this on the piano, but I need a note in between these notes. I don't know what to do. But he basically he sacrificed some of the authenticity of it in order to translate it, because this was at the time when basically every every unrecognized nationality that was under the Austrian control, they all wanted to have their own national music. This is when you have like Czech music, Polish music entering into the classical space. So people were doing that. So the way it's been passed down, I mean, there's a Wikipedia article on Istrian scale, if you look it up, and it's just basically an equal tempered diminished scale in two voices in parallel thirds, which, that's not how it sounds. But when people are dealing with the actual instruments, there's a very interesting article from this Croatian ethnomusicologist named Dario Marušić, who he theorizes this idea of what he calls like bimusicality or polymusicality, which is sort of the simultaneous existence of like multiple tuning systems at the same time, where people will, and there's videos of like people will play on the traditional instruments with an accordion, and it'll just be like totally out of tune, but sound crazy and just beautifully clashing things. And I also, from my own anecdotal experience, I've seen, for instance, people play on the bagpipes, like they'll play like a church song or like a popular song that would be in, a major key in equal temperament, whatever. And people just start singing along. They'll recognize the melody immediately just from the shapes. And they'll like sing in the like right key while he's playing in the wrong key. And so I think there's something about music cognition that could be explored in all of this. But basically the short answer is there's no set way of dealing with it. And people kind of don't really self-consciously think of it as a microtonal music in the same way that like, Arabic or Turkish or Indian music really has that, that understanding baked into it.
Right, I see. So it's kind of like there's a varying level of musical awareness about which world traditions are microtonal, and people aren't as aware that the Croatian tradition is inherently microtonal.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it is like, I think the official name, like this tradition it has a UNESCO heritage designation, and the official name is like non-tempered two-voice singing in the Istrian mode. So everybody says it's non-tempered. They know that it means something, but it isn't, to my knowledge, it isn't really explored structurally, compositionally, which is what I was trying to do with Phantom Islands, basically, is something coming from this other perspective of experimental music, of kind of a free jazz chamber music approach, trying to really figure out how to justify that tuning system with Western instruments. So that's kind of part of that project.
What would you say are some of the hardest, the most difficult instruments to make behave in the tuning systems you want when you're doing these sorts of projects?
Bagpipes, definitely. They just don't behave in general. I had somebody at a performance say to me recently, because I was like playing and like I stop and then it just keeps going. And she said, and she was happy about this. She said, "Oh, it's like an animal and it keeps on singing." And so that kind of thing applies to the tuning and well. So that's part of why like I adjust the rest of the band to the bagpipe, which is fine for me because I like that tuning system. But yeah, I would say that. I mean, and then in terms of Western instruments, you got to just be aware of like when you're writing for oboe and clarinet, which I did on the record, there's like, certain registers where they can be very microtonal and other ones where they can't. And that just involves going back and forth with the players. I actually recently wrote a piece for the Croatian bagpipe and sanghwang, which is like the Korean mouth organ, like sheng in China or shou in Japan. It's like the same thing basically,
like that tall one.
Exactly. Yeah,
looks like a little organ pipe piece, but it's just
exactly
yeah.
And so that's in some kind of like, I think like some kind of Pythagorean tuning, which is interesting because even within Korean and Japanese and Chinese music, it is like doesn't fit exactly with the rest of their tuning system. But I did a duo piece for bagpipes and that, and really just exploring these kind of very like rich multiphonic textures I can get with like a lot of difference tones between the two reeds, and then having that with like a high cluster on the sanghwang, and then just the difference tones are like ringing all over the place. And so part of the way I like to think about it is like I don't necessarily even want to make all the instruments behave in a tuning system. I just kind of want them to be able to do what they do, and I'm okay with the systems kind of colliding with each other and contradicting each other. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of people that maybe think that not systematizing it is sort of a non-Western way to do it, but I don't know if that's really accurate. It's more like there's these different methodologies that you may or may not want to use, and it's really refreshing to see someone such as yourself creating things from tuning systems in a systematized way, and then also sort of in a non-systematized way, and seeing how those can interact. I think people don't want to do that because then they would have to admit that they might not know all the theory, and that might be scary.
Yes.
But I think it's really exciting to see what happens. I was noticing in Cembalo Bruto the idea that you have things detuned by a sixth tone. And I noticed that in the voice leading in a very poignant way. I was wondering if you see any pros or cons in the sound when you're listening to something versus like something that has a systematized detuning where you know exactly what it is. Versus something where you're just letting the instruments do whatever and they kind of have their own natural clash. Is there a difference in sound for you in general, or is it maybe something you couldn't even put your finger on? I'd really be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it in those terms. I mean, I think for me, when I'm working with guitars, it's like they're already, they have the frets in 12 equal temperament unless you change them, which people are doing. But like if I'm working with these regular guitars, it's like there already is this grid. Yeah. And so I don't need, like, I don't think anything is particularly gained from me tuning one so it's like off grid. It's like I just kind of want to change the grid. And really the thing that inspired that tuning in particular was that I was like I was trying to do a more systematic analysis of the bagpipe tuning. And basically the way that it works is that there's these two minor thirds. You can think of it as like a tonic and a dominant, and a lot of the music will move between them. But of course they're different sizes. And to get into JI world for a second, the tuning that I discovered is on my instrument. If I set it up in a particular way, is basically I have the tonic minor third is a 7/6.
Yeah.
So you have the septimal thing, and then the dominant one just below it is an 11/13 or 13/11. So
Whoa.
that means I have 11, 12, 13, 14. That's like the scale of the instrument, and like this is how I ended up fitting it with the other things. But to get back to the guitar piece, what I realized is like, yeah, so there's a big difference in the sound between the 7/6 and the 13/11, just because they're just different widths. And I feel like when we get into this level of detail, you open up so much more. So I wanted to have a microtonal tuning that was like, it had to be derived from 12 because I'm working with guitars, but I didn't want it to be 24 because I wanted to have an asymmetry.
Right.
And that was really the thing, was having these different sizes. And so like I found out like, now I have, for instance, if I'm splitting the notes between the two guitars, I have like a diminished chord. I have two voicings of it now that are different. I
was hearing so many diminished chords in the dances one.
Yeah. That's basically the whole point of that. So for instance, like if you think about like, the way we divide a fifth into like, or a major triad and a minor triad, you're basically splitting the fifth by a major third and a minor third. And depending on which of those is on the bottom determines whether you have a major chord or a minor chord. And so now I found out if I have two different sizes of minor third, I can do the same thing with a diminished chord. And so a lot of that piece is moving back and forth between these kinds of things, or like having these hot-cutting textures where like one guitar will be on the bottom and the other one will, and the other one will be on top, and they'll switch positions. And so it's really just playing around with the asymmetry, which was something that I was just inspired by the bagpipe.
Yeah. How much of that album Cembalo Bruto is notated? I saw that it was in 72 tone equal temperament. And my guess is that since you mentioned the sixth tone, that you've tuned them like a sixth tone off of each other, and then there's like a JI tuning on the major third or something, but maybe, or near JI tuning on the major third, but maybe that's not right. I'd love to hear you explain that scheme and how the players played it.
It is literally just, I had one guitarist tune the entire guitar down a sixth tone, and it's written in completely conventionally. Like the bottom guitar, it's like guitar one, and then guitar two, minus 33.3 cents. Like, and that's it. It's extremely simple. I like simplicity. Like I like to go conceptually complicated, but then when I actually have to work with humans, I like to simplify. But there were a lot of these JI sounds that ended up coming out that I really didn't anticipate. Like I was really just thinking of these kind of proportions of the intervals, but I had a really close approximation of septimal stuff. And something I found was just if I voiced a chord, if I voiced a chord between the two guitars, so that basically all of the notes that would be lowered in a JI thing, so basically all the things going up the overtone series, if I just put them in the lower guitar, my ear would just sort of like correct it and hear it as JI, even though it wasn't. Oh. So for instance, like I have like a major third that's, it's minus 33 cents. It's not, minus 16 cents or whatever. But like if I voice it in a chord with a very close approximation of the septimal stuff, then I'll like, my brain just adjusts it. Like, oh yeah, that's just like adjust the dominant chord or whatever. So
it's just fantastic. You can trick your ear into doing lots of things by changing the context of the music. Like if you're do what you're doing and you have a pitch, and then you have a pitch that's almost that in a context where they would be the same, your ear is like, oh, those should be the same. They basically are, but one's just a little bit off.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the just properties of working in the temperament, I guess. It's either a strength or a weakness, depending on how you feel about that. But yeah, if I'm working in it, I might as well.
I'm sure the performers really appreciate the simplicity of you just notating things conventionally. And I'm surprised there are not more guitar works out there that just like retune 12-tone guitars to different tuning systems that are like, 24, 36, 48, 72. You can get a lot in 72. People should probably do a lot in 18 as well.
No, that's interesting. I think, yeah, getting into like kind of the close like not 12 based, but close to 12 based mathematically.
Right.
That could be interesting. I heard one piece a while ago that was like six G strings all tuned in successive sixth tones apart.
Agustin Castilla Avila?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes,
Oh,
I saw that.
Yeah.
I basically used the same idea of, okay, successive tones, but I was using like 9-tone equal temperament. And so I was making it so you could only play frets 0, 4, and 8. If you were thinking of sixth tone notation, each string would be tuned like E, F up, G down, and then the next one, I don't know what it would start on. I guess I tuned the G up to G sharp for a major third, but it's like higher. It's not a second away from the G down, but it's like an octave in a second. So then you'd have like G sharp, A up, B down would be the last three things. So they're all completely out of tension with each other, but I guess it's easier for the composer to think that way. Oh, just one string away is one note away, but then the performer's just like, oh my god, none of this makes any sense.
Well, yeah, because they have to like literally reverse the way they think about the instrument, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, if you have people that are willing to put up with you, then you can do stuff like that. I think it depends.
Yeah.
It all depends on those relationships, I guess.
So I'm listening to a little bit of Phantom Islands here. I was listening to, how do you pronounce that first track? Is it
Jig? It's a jig.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I hear you're sort of switching between two really interesting chords at the beginning. It sounds like they're vaguely related to JI in like an 11 limit or 13 limit way, but I don't think that they're the tonal chords exactly. Would you mind giving us a little briefing on what those might be?
Yeah, you're right, and you have good ears. It's basic. So it is. So that's Alec Goldfarb playing guitar. He's also a great microtonal composer, and basically, so he has a guitar now with like a interchangeable JI fretboard system with like 14 tones to the octave. And when I was writing this music, I was expecting to be able to use that, but it wasn't ready in time for the recording. So I switched everything back to using like a conventional, like a 12-tone fretboard, and then just tuning the strings to the harmonic. So it's like starting from the lowest note, you have C, and then you've got 13/8, 9/8, 7, or 11/7/5, going on. And so it would be sort of an O-tonal chord if you just play harmonics, but then I was, messing around with just interacting between the open strings and fretted notes, and I kind of found this like weird, like what I call it's like a bizarro blues texture, which basically corresponds to those two central like chords or harmonic zones of the bagpipe when you play it idiomatically or traditionally. And so that's kind of how that structure works. And it's like, and I think it doesn't sound quite JI because, it's a combination of these fretted notes that are like close but not exact, and the open strings. But that actually works because, again, the bagpipe isn't exactly JI. It is all approximations. And you can really hear it at the end, I think, when everybody is playing, when you have all the horns, because I didn't notate the horns microtonally at all. I'm just like, just play it, tune it by ear. And you can basically hear you have the bagpipe tuning, the guitar tuning, and the horn tuning. And these are technically 3 different tunings, but they're kind of bridged together by the guitar being in this middle zone. and it just kind of glues it together somehow. Yeah.
Do you draw from influences of other folk music besides sort of Croatian folk music? Like, what would you say those influences are on this new album?
Yeah, there's a bunch of influences. I think more conceptual than like audibly musical sometimes. But for instance, if we're talking about jig, I mean, it's called jig because it is taking this. There's a 9/8 rhythm in Irish music called the slip jig, and it's just a jig but with three beats of three instead of two.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the famous Balkan 9, like 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. And I was sort of just messing around with the bagpipe, thinking about my distant days playing Irish and Scottish music and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I mean, there's an interesting kind of space in between these things. So that's why I called it jig, but then I wrote it in like, the Slavic way. So that's sort of like how you feel the rhythm depends on if you're thinking Irishly or Bulgarianly, basically. But then in the context of like a jazz band, it becomes this sort of like, like West African inspired, like John Coltrane-esque thing.
I love track 4. May the sea be his grave 3 to 4.
I guess, yes, like the third and fourth movements of the whole thing. So
like things sort of evolve into like a free jazz world and peak, so to speak, and then they kind of die down a little bit. I mean, there's instruments galore in this thing, obviously, but there was a certain instrument I wanted to ask you what it was called. I think it was around 7 minutes in. Let me see if I can find it.
that is Alec doing some like I don't know like what it is. weird guitar shredding stuff. Yeah, at that point in the piece, it's like that's like the only time on the whole record when I have him actually just like go back to regular 12-tone tuning, and just for the purposes of I just wanted, you know, guitar shredding stuff. And then in the later section when Xavier the saxophonist is kind of playing this sort of like I gave him like kind of like a tone row, and I was like, move through this freely and like ornament however you want, and there's some quarter tone stuff in there. But you know, because Alec he's really deep into Indian music, and so I wanted him to do the kind of accompanying thing where the accompanist shadows the melody instrument, and so all of the microtonal stuff he's just bending there, and he's great at that. Actually, he recently did a version of the Chris Otto's violin duo for guitar, where he's just bending everything and getting these perfect JI chords. And I don't know if there's a recording of that out yet, but I know he's performed it, and it's very good.
I'm gonna need to look that up. I'm also surprised people don't bend with the guitar more to get microtonal intervals, because like it's already in a grid and you can also like bend it. I've been doing that with pre-bending sometimes to play. It's limited. But
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps if you're coming like from because you mean in Indian music, it's like that is the combination of bending and also like having to do it accurately. Like that's a big part of the tradition,
yeah.
like of the identity. And for instance, I was recently, before you're asking about what other folk music influences I have, Korean music is big for me, and I got to go to a workshop in Korea this last summer, and it's very interesting to me because all of these instruments have this extreme like flexibility of pitch, and they use it for these expressive purposes, but they really don't think of the music as microtonal, and so they don't think of it as adjusting to achieve certain results in the same way that in Indian music they do. And I think that's partly because in Indian music there's a drone and there's these other factors. But it's funny because I would hear Korean musicians that sometimes like bend into stuff and be like, oh yeah, that's clearly an 11 or a 7 or something. And it's like they're obviously hearing it, but they don't think about it in that way.
In Obokuri, are you using the Croatian bagpipe tuning you discussed where like it has orientation? Correct me if I'm wrong. Did you say it has like sort of the orientation of a diminished scale, but the sizes are not close to a diminished scale because some of the minor thirds are off in very specific ways, one being a 7/6 and one being a 13/11?
Yeah, actually, with this reed setup, this is one of the weird things about this instrument and all wind instruments, which I don't understand. And actually, it was funny. I was reading Genesis of the Music the other day, and like, there's a part where Parch is basically like, "I will never try to make a wind instrument because it's too complicated." And I was like, "Wow, good thing I didn't read this before I like did all these projects building and modifying wind instruments."
Ahead of his time.
Yeah, but basically, it's like I have different sets of reeds that will put into the same chanter with no other modifications will like completely change like the behavior of certain things. It completely change not just the like the absolute pitch, but the relative pitch between notes. So I'm actually using a different set of reeds, which is at a higher pitch and does not lock in exactly the same way as the JI stuff. And honestly, I don't really, on the record, I don't use this with the other instruments in any kind of specific intonational way, just because I have the other reeds for that, and I think it's better. So the reeds, these reeds, they're louder, they're higher, and I can also get these high multiphonic tones by underblowing, which the other reeds in the JI tuning don't do for some reason.
Had no idea the reeds would change the relative pitch as well as the register, because I know that like if you have a reed instrument and you have the reed and you pull it out and pull it in, that's tuning because of changing the length of the tube. Like if you're sharp, you would pull it out so that there's more length, I think. Is a different reed, is it so long that it's changing the effective length of the tube, or is it just very, very sensitive to conditions, or like what's going on, really?
I really don't know. It's a mystery. Honestly, I mean, and this kind of goes back to what I was to my work with the Vex collection, which sort of started this, because our whole idea was to like, oh, we're going to have the Korean instruments and the bagpipes, and then we're going to 3D print all of these like microtonal pipes and stuff. And like I was trying to study the math, and like I was taking like reed making lessons and stuff, and basically nothing from like a theoretical perspective that should have worked ever worked. And It came down to basically, I think I wrote in the liner notes, it's like I felt less like a trained musician and more like some kind of like oracle, like trying to interpret the will of the gods. Because basically I was just sawing PVC pipes and like measuring and drilling holes and like doing trial by error and the reeds, were extremely difficult to figure out. And so I still honestly don't understand it. From talking to bagpipe makers who do this like professionally, they're basically saying like, yeah, if you're thinking about like how a pipe is going to behave, you have to actually start with the reed. So I was kind of going from this perspective, like thinking about, string instruments, and so I was like, well, yeah, if you have a vibrating length of air, it should vibrate at a certain pitch. But unless you basically have as a controlled variable the behavior of the reed and have locked that in, you really can't predict how it's going to work. So we luckily, like a month before the premiere of that, we luckily figured out a prototype of a reed that would like work basically in the tuning we wanted, which was for these instruments. These are we called it micro aulos. I have some here. They're basically all these pipes with this one, with holes in it, and the idea was to play two at once, and each one has a set of like 3 to 5 pitches in it. But then there's 10 pipes, and the entire set will be like 31 Edo basically. And the idea was to basically get around the fact that you can't really like make a wind instrument that will do 31 Edo accurately because there's too many holes. Right. And also they get too close together and stuff. So this was sort of like we distributed it out, and the idea was so that you could play two at once and like layer them into like composite modes and stuff. And I think the concept works. It's just like the instruments are so finicky, and maybe at some point I'd work with like a professional to figure that out better. But so this is to say, like, I don't know why, and this is one of the things I actually really like about working with this Croatian bagpipe, because it's like there's so many just weird things that I'm still discovering. Like I was playing I was playing, like doing a free improvisation with a group a few days ago on it, and I discovered new things I had never thought of before. So it's endlessly inspiring.
Yeah, that's
when you're not trying to make it do a specific thing that it won't do, then it's really annoying.
Right. Yeah, you can kind of treat it like found sound or music concrete, and it's like, you've got the thing and then you figure out what it gives you, as opposed to trying to design the specific tuning and then trying to fit it into that. It sounds really, really difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's my solo record, Mech, is basically, that's a documentation of my process of learning all these things about the instrument. Because I would just go off somewhere in the field, basically, and record and just try to find different techniques and stuff. And sort of that's kind of the foundation of then the later, more specifically composed stuff that I did on Phantom Islands.
If you had to give a description of the tunings for each track in Phantom Islands, what would you say? I actually didn't know you were interested in 31 Tet, but it makes sense.
Not on this. There's no 31 Tet here. That was just for Vex Collection. And yeah, I mean, I'm interested in it. I feel like I have a lot more to explore. Honestly, with the higher, I'm much more comfortable thinking in JI than I am dealing with equal temperaments at this point, but maybe that will change. But
the opposite.
Okay, great. So the basic fundamental tuning for most of the tracks is this sort of JI extension of the bagpipe tuning. So that's taking that like 11, 12, 13, 14 partial structure that just appears in the bagpipe, kind of giving that to the guitar and the open strings, and then sort of allowing for this overlap. But then there are notes that I have that the guitar doesn't have. There's obviously, with the fretted notes, a whole lot of notes the guitar has that I don't have, and then kind of fitting the rest of the ensemble into that space. But then at certain points I will move, like in I believe it is, both tracks 2 and 3 move into 24 at some point. In track 3, it's very it's much more explicit. Like I use the 11th partial to like kind of pivot into 24, and then that continues into the next track, into track 4. So for instance, a good way to check this actually is like, if you listen to the beginning of track 3, I'm playing this interpretation of a folk melody on the bagpipe. Then the beginning of track 4 is the same melody, but in 24, played oboe and clarinet. But the funny thing is that it is actually the 24-tone version that is the authentic folk version, because that's a direct transcription of two women singing in that tuning that I recorded in Croatian.
Oh,
which I can send you. But yeah, they're nailing perfect 250 cent thirds, like, consistently. Which is, yeah, to me is insane. So I really wanted to like just document that. And it's funny because like I'm playing it on the bagpipe, which would be sort of, you would think it's like the more traditional tuning, but when I do that for people from there, they're like, oh, that's so weird. Like you're playing vocal music on the bagpipe. Like you're not supposed to do that.
Oh.
So it's just strange. So yeah, but that's a good example of like, those are the two basic, tunings, is this JI thing and then going to 24. And then there's stuff like obokuri, which is just like, it's just whatever the bagpipe is in. That's why I have to duo with drums, so I don't have to think about it.
Perfect. Well, this is all really fascinating stuff. I'm very, very excited for the public to hear this album.
Thanks so much for doing this, and it's cool to have a space where I can talk about all these nerdy aspects of this music, which I don't get. Yeah, there aren't that many spaces to talk about this, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm trying to create that space because I too feel the sting of not being able to discuss it normally a lot of times. So I think it's really great that we get to talk about this, and I'm always very excited to hear the kinds of things that people bring to the table. So interesting work, and I can't wait to see where it goes, especially with those 250 cent steps. I'm realizing a lot of the stuff that I'm hearing from your music might come from step sizes that are near that. Like the 13/11 is kind of a low minor third, right?
Yes.
So does it almost count as one of those sometimes?
Yeah, well, this is what I'm saying, is that this is not a codified tradition, really. So like I was listening to, I got access to some archival recordings from this village folklore society from this particular village that's like basically, it's like up in the hills on this island, and sort of like if you're close to the water, people will sing more in equal temperament, but then if you're like up and like away from the Italian influence on the coast, like you'll sing these more harsh sounds. But basically, like I was just listening and like kind of mapping it, and it's basically the thirds range from like basically the widest will be a septimal third or a 13/11 or something, and then the narrowest will be this 250 cent. And yeah, and so like a lot of the early theorists, like they didn't know whether to call these things seconds or thirds because they're right in the middle.
Right. They didn't have that microtonal, I don't know, awareness that we have today. I don't know. I feel like back in olden times there was more of a pressure to like take everything and fit it into whatever theory you had.
Well, yeah, well, some people did. I mean, like this guy Mat Muntz, like he would write about it like, oh, this is a unique thing, and he had critics who were writing him being like, how are you saying this is microtonal? These are just dumb peasants. They don't know how to sing good. It's like, they'll just make it up. Man, well, I don't know. I have like one thing, which is, I think is a little interesting, is that, so if you know how in Parch he talks about, there's like certain people throughout history that basically recognize like septimal intervals as consonant. One of them being Giuseppe Tartini, the Italian composer.
Yeah, I was going to mention him actually.
But he's from Trieste, which is right there. Trieste is basically the northernmost part of Istria, and it's surrounded basically by Slovenian villages and stuff where people would be singing in ways like this. So I kind of have this theory that I need to research more about. Like, I feel like perhaps Tartini's understanding of like septimal harmony could be from hearing people singing in these kinds of intervals. So I don't know. That's my little, ancient aliens-esque speculative tuning theory.
What an absolutely delightful, obscure, brilliant connection to make. I really hope that's true.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Well, anyways, thanks so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate chatting about this.
All right. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, of course. I had a great time. Adios.
Yeah, me too. See ya.
Bye.
The track you just heard is the last one off of Matt's new album, Phantom Islands, which you can find on Bandcamp starting today. Please check it out. If you want to help us out, please leave our podcast a review on iTunes and spread the word. We try to release new episodes every now and then. I'd like to have 100 episodes by 2024. Now and Zen is available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, or you can find our RSS feed at nowandzen.libsyn.com. Thanks once again to Matt for joining us, and thanks to everybody listening. We're here to spread the love of microtones, and you're part of the team. As always, I'll remind you that we have a Patreon account, and if the Patreon account gets to 60 patrons, I will go back to making episodes monthly, like I did when the podcast first started. This episode is made possible by the generous support of our patrons, our Xen Harmonic patrons, as well as our Xen Harmonic gods, Mike Battaglia, Adam Freese, Matthew Sheeran, Vincenzo Sicarella, Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Joe Weigel, and Tina Harmon-Carto. Thanks so much, everyone. Our next episodes will feature Doug and Dave and Chris Bandy, both in February. Catch you later on Now and Zen. Adios.